September 1944, Deep South. German prisoners of war, still certain of Nazi ideals, step into a U.S. camp and freeze. Armed Black American soldiers are issuing orders. Everything they had been taught about racial inferiority collapses in an instant. 425,000 prisoners transported across the Atlantic, only to find the world's rules upside down. Suddenly, it wasn't just a war over territory, it was a battle over truth itself. How could Nazi propaganda be so wrong? From the earliest days of the Nazi regime, every German classroom, training ground, and movie theater became a stage for a single message: the supremacy of the so-called Aryan race. Textbooks taught children to see themselves as inheritors of a pure bloodline, destined to rule over others. In newsreels and posters, Black people were reduced to grotesque caricatures, figures to be mocked, pitied, or feared. Propaganda films produced in the late 1930s and early 1940s, like Jude Seuss and countless newsreel shorts, hammered home the idea that Germany's enemies were not just political, but racial. Images of French colonial soldiers, many of them Black, were used to stoke fears of racial defilement and chaos. The message was clear. Black soldiers were portrayed as undisciplined, incapable, and unworthy of respect. By 1940, these lessons saturated German society. Soldiers heading to the front carried with them more than rifles and rations. They carried a worldview shaped by relentless propaganda. Leaflets distributed to the Wehrmacht warned of the dangers of hybridization and the supposed threat posed by Black troops fighting for the Allies. In training camps, instructors described the American military as weak, fractured by racial strife, and led astray by the presence of Black men in uniform. Films shown to troops depicted Black soldiers as comic relief or menacing outsiders, never as equals or capable adversaries. This ideological campaign wasn't limited to adults. School children were shown illustrated readers where heroic Aryan figures triumphed over cartoonish, dehumanized Black characters. Board games and children's books echoed the same themes, making racial hierarchy a matter of everyday play and imagination. The result was a generation convinced that the world's order was set, and that Nazi Germany stood at its pinnacle. Inside Germany, these messages shaped not just policy, but personal expectations. Young men conscripted into the army believed they were fighting for civilization itself, against an enemy defined as much by race as by nation. The idea that Black soldiers could hold authority or even serve effectively was dismissed as Allied propaganda. In the mind of the average German soldier, the prospect of being commanded or guarded by a Black American was not just unlikely, it was impossible. These beliefs traveled with every German POW loaded onto a transport ship bound for the United States. They arrived on American soil certain of their place in the world, their sense of superiority reinforced by years of indoctrination. The stage was set for a confrontation not just with an enemy army, but with the reality behind the propaganda they had been taught to trust. By the summer of 1943, the United States was holding an astonishing number of German prisoners, about 425,000 men, scattered across roughly 700 camps nationwide. The largest concentration of these camps lay in the American South, a region where segregation shaped every aspect of daily life. In places like Aliceville, Alabama, and Ruston, Louisiana, German POWs arrived by the trainload, stepping off into a world defined by Jim Crow laws. The logic behind this placement was practical. Southern states offered vast stretches of farmland and a steady demand for manual labor. The U.S. Army quickly set a policy. German prisoners would be put to work in agriculture, timber, and public works, filling gaps left by American men fighting overseas. Camp Aliceville, for example, soon housed up to 6,000 German soldiers, most captured from Rommel's Afrika Korps. Rows of barracks and mess halls rose alongside cotton fields and pine forests. Local farmers lined up to request work details, and camp officials organized labor detachments, sending groups of POWs into the fields under military supervision. This was not unique to Alabama. Across Mississippi, Texas, and Louisiana, camps like Hearn and Ruston became hubs for labor assignments, their populations swelling with each new convoy of prisoners. These assignments brought German POWs into close contact with the realities of the segregated South. Army regulations required strict separation between black and white personnel, and local custom reinforced the divide. Yet the logistics of running such massive camps, feeding, guarding, and transporting thousands of men, meant that black American soldiers were a constant presence. Many served in quartermaster and engineer units, handling supplies, maintenance, and sometimes escorting POWs to job sites. On the farms, black civilian laborers worked the same fields, often within sight or earshot of the German prisoners. In the camp kitchens, supply rooms, and laundry facilities, black soldiers kept the machinery of captivity running. For the German POWs, the scale of the operation was staggering. They had been told to expect chaos and disorder in America's ranks, but instead found a system that was vast, regimented, and, at least on the surface, orderly. The numbers alone were hard to ignore. With hundreds of thousands of prisoners and more than 1 million black Americans serving in the U.S. Army, daily encounters were all but guaranteed. Every work assignment, every trip to the fields, every meal in the mess hall became an opportunity for contact. The boundaries of race and authority were visible everywhere, enforced by both Army policy and local law. Yet, in the routines of camp life, German prisoners found themselves face to face with black Americans, sometimes as guards, sometimes as cooks, sometimes as fellow laborers. The world they had entered was nothing like the one described in Nazi propaganda. The stage was set for a series of encounters that would test the beliefs they had carried from home. More than 1 million black Americans wore U.S. Army uniforms during World War II. They drove trucks, loaded ships, built roads, and kept the machinery of war moving. Yet, for all their service, the Army kept them apart. Segregated units, separate barracks, and limited roles, rarely allowed to fight on the front lines. The official policy of segregation held firm until 1948, but its consequences were felt every day in the war years. Black soldiers found themselves stationed at camps across the South, assigned to support roles that kept them close to the heart of the war effort, but always at a distance from full equality. The contradiction sharpened in the mess halls. In April 1944, Corporal Rupert Trimmingham, a black soldier, wrote a letter that would echo far beyond the walls of his camp. He described watching 24 German prisoners, men who had worn the enemy's uniform just months before, seated at tables, eating their meals, talking and smoking as if they were honored guests. Meanwhile, Trimmingham and his fellow black soldiers, American citizens in service to their country, were forced to eat in the kitchen, away from the tables, denied even the dignity of a seat among men they were supposed to be guarding. Trimmingham's letter, published in Yank magazine, struck a nerve. Are these men sworn enemies of this country? Are we not American soldiers? He wrote. The words captured a bitter irony that was impossible to ignore. German POWs, brought across the ocean as captives, were granted privileges and courtesies that black Americans could only dream of in their own land. The paradox was visible in every meal, every roll call, every moment of daily life in those camps. The Army's rules made the boundaries clear, but the reality was harder to accept. Black soldiers kept the camps running, often working longer hours and under stricter discipline than the prisoners themselves. The scale was staggering. More than 1 million black Americans in uniform, more than 425,000 German POWs scattered across 700 camps. Yet, in the eyes of Army policy, those lines of race and privilege mattered more than the lines of allegiance. For the German prisoners, These scenes were as bewildering as they were revealing. For black soldiers, they were a daily reminder of a fight that stretched far beyond the battlefield. Between 1943 and 1946, German prisoners of war in Mississippi were assigned to farm labor under the supervision of black American soldiers. Each morning, trucks carried the prisoners out to fields of cotton, peanuts, and pulpwood. Instead of white guards, the men found themselves escorted by black Americans in uniform, some with the stripes of non-commissioned officers. This was not the America described in Nazi propaganda. In the Delta, county rosters listed black quartermaster units as the ones overseeing labor details and managing supplies. At Camp Clinton, black soldiers directed the loading of equipment, checked headcounts, and issued orders in English or carefully practiced German. The presence of black authority unsettled many prisoners of war. Carl Schmidt, a prisoner, wrote home, "We are guarded by Negro soldiers. They are strict but fair. It is not at all as we were told in Germany." Processing lines at camp gates offered another challenge to old beliefs. NARA photographs from the era show black soldiers checking bags, recording names, and directing columns of Germans toward their barracks. In one image, a black military police officer stands at the front of a group of prisoners of war, clipboard in hand, the prisoners waiting in silence. For many Germans, this was their first experience of being subject to the authority of someone Nazi ideology had labeled inferior. Labor assignments meant daily, repetitive contact. In the fields, black guards enforced discipline, broke up quarrels, and ensured no one slipped away during the long hours under the Mississippi sun. At midday, while prisoners rested in the shade, guards stood watch, rifles at their sides, boots planted in the mud. For the Americans, it was routine. For the Germans, each day chipped away at the certainty instilled by years of indoctrination. The same men once described as incapable of command were now setting the rules. These encounters extended beyond the fields. In workshops, black mechanics oversaw repairs. In supply depots, they issued rations and tools. The repetition left its mark. For some prisoners of war, the realization grew. The racial order they had been promised was unraveling. Authority and respect were determined by uniform, not color. The propaganda of home faded with each season in the American South. At the edge of every camp, the rules of privilege were drawn in lines as clear as the painted signs on a bathroom door. In February 1944, Private Bert Barbero, a black soldier stationed at a Texas POW camp, described a scene that spoke louder than any order from headquarters. The latrines were divided, one side for black soldiers, the other for German prisoners and white Americans. Barbero wrote that this arrangement placed, in his words, the tyrant over the liberator. The men who had marched under Hitler's flag were granted access to facilities denied to the Americans in uniform who guarded them. This was not an isolated incident. Across the South, camp regulations and local custom combined to create a hierarchy that made little sense to anyone who stopped to look. German POWs, enemies by every definition of the war, walked freely into the white restrooms, dined at tables with tablecloths, and smoked cigarettes in the shade. Black American soldiers, meanwhile, were told to wait outside, to use separate, often inferior facilities, and to take their meals in kitchens or out of sight. The message was unmistakable. The color of your skin determined your dignity, not the uniform you wore or the oath you had sworn. For black soldiers, the daily reminder cut deep. The men they guarded, men who had fought for a regime that called them subhuman, now enjoyed privileges they themselves could not claim. The irony was bitter, and the humiliation impossible to ignore. Some black soldiers wrote home about the injustice, describing how German prisoners laughed at the rules or expressed surprise that their American captors faced such restrictions. For the German POWs, the contradiction was jarring. Many had arrived convinced of their own superiority, only to find the American system upholding a racial order as rigid as the one they had left behind, just with different winners and losers. Babero's letter, cited by historians and echoed in other soldiers' accounts, captured a truth that no propaganda could erase. The reality of American segregation, laid bare in the daily routines of the camps, forced everyone, prisoner and guard alike, to confront the gap between ideals and practice. For some Germans, the experience planted the first seeds of doubt about everything they had been taught. For Black Americans, it was another chapter in a struggle that would not end with the war. Inside the wire, another kind of confrontation unfolded, one that played out in classrooms, reading circles, and late-night discussions rather than in the fields or mess halls. The U.S. Army, together with civilian educators, launched re-education programs for German POWs, hoping to chip away at the foundations of Nazi ideology. These efforts went beyond lectures. Camps organized structured discussion groups, distributed American newspapers, and screened films about democracy and civil rights. Some prisoners signed up for English classes or joined debates about post-war Europe. The curriculum often included readings on the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights, paired with open conversations about American society, including its contradictions and its ideals. For many POWs, the experience was unsettling. One diarist at Camp Ruston wrote, "We are encouraged to question what we believed was certain. I find myself arguing with my own thoughts." The presence of Black American soldiers, once described as inferior in Nazi textbooks, now became a living counter-argument. In camp seminars, educators sometimes invited prisoners to reflect on their daily encounters, asking what it meant to see Black men in uniform, giving orders or enforcing rules. The answers were rarely simple. Some POWs clung to old prejudices, but others began to doubt the propaganda they had absorbed since childhood. Over time, the combination of routine exposure and formal discussion created cracks in the certainties they had carried across the Atlantic. What began as shock and confusion slowly gave way to questions, and in some cases, to genuine change. In the waning months of the war, a scene unfolded in rural Louisiana that would linger in the memories of those who witnessed it. German prisoners of war, assigned to agricultural labor, found themselves working alongside local Black Americans and under the supervision of Black U.S. soldiers. The boundaries that had shaped their world, drawn by both Nazi ideology and American segregation, blurred in the shared heat of the cotton fields. There were moments of uneasy silence, but also unexpected conversations, brief exchanges of cigarettes, or a nod of respect at the end of a long day. For some Germans, these encounters planted questions that would echo long after their return home. Letters and interviews collected after 1946 reveal how these daily interactions unsettled old certainties. One former prisoner of war recalled his confusion at seeing Black soldiers in charge, reflecting years later, "We had been told they were less than us, but they were our supervisors, and they did their jobs well." Another remembered the embarrassment he felt when given privileges denied to the very Americans guarding him. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. For Black veterans, the experience also left a mark. Some spoke of the bitter irony, risking their lives for a country that honored its enemies before its own. Yet, out of this paradox grew a new sense of resolve, a determination to demand the dignity and rights that had been withheld. The fields of Louisiana became for a time a crossroads where propaganda unraveled and new convictions quietly took root. By the end of World War II, more than 425,000 German prisoners had been held in over 700 camps across the United States, many in the racially segregated South. First-hand encounters with over 1 million Black American soldiers directly contradicted the Nazi propaganda these POWs had been taught. Documented letters like Bert Babero's 1944 account and reports from camps in Mississippi and Louisiana show the shock and reassessment German POWs experienced when faced with Black soldiers serving in roles of authority and skill. Yet, the full extent of individual ideological change remains partly unknown. as not all POW testimonies were preserved or released. Today, this history exposes how propaganda can collapse under the weight of lived reality and reminds us that systems of racial injustice once shaped both enemies and allies. The documents and testimonies preserved in archives confirm that, for thousands, the truth they witnessed challenged the lies they had been taught.